Welcome to Staffworks Explained. If you are here for the first time, please consider subscribing to this channel. You can watch other videos that you have done on different topics on Kenya, the East African region, and also Africa at large. In this video, we'll be talking about what Dangote want Kenya to do so that it can build the East Africa refinery in Lamu. A 17 billion US dollar refinery processing up to 700,000 barrels of crude oil per day is no ordinary investment. If Aliko Dangote and his group deliver the proposed Lamu project, Kenya would be positioning itself as the center of East African fuel supply chain and potentially turning Lamu into strategic port project into a major industrial and energy hub. But there is a condition that deserves much more attention than the headline investment figure. Dangote is not simply bringing money to Kenya and asking for a piece of land. The business case requires crude supply, infrastructure, large regional market, as well as a predictable rules. In practical terms, Kenya has also to make this commercially viable for a refinery of this scale to operate for decades. That means infrastructure must connect, regional governments must cooperate, regulations must remain predictable, and refinery must be able to compete with imported fuels. Here we examine what Dangote needs from Kenya, why Lamu was selected, the difficult question of protecting a massive private investment without creating a fuel monopoly, and whether East African market is actually large enough to justify such an enormous refinery. We start by saying that Lamu is no longer just a port project. Dangote Industries confirmed in July that Lamu has been selected as the site for East Africa refinery. Company officials said soil testing was underway and engineering as well as design work has already started. The proposed investment has been reported at around 17 billion US dollars, with construction expected to take place roughly 3 years once the necessary approvals were in place. The scale is striking. The proposed refinery would have a nameplate capacity of 700,000 barrels per day. That is larger than Dangote's 650 barrels per day refinery in Lekki, Lagos, and would make the Lamu facility the largest refinery in East Africa by capacity. But there is an important distinction between capacity and actual production. A refinery capable of processing 700,000 barrels a day does not automatically mean it will process that amount every day. It needs reliable crude, maintenance, utilities, storage, shipping access, financial, and above all, customers willing to buy its product at competitive prices. This is where Kenya's responsibilities start. First, Kenya must make Lamu physically work. A refinery is not an isolated factory. It is the center of a much larger system. Crude oil must arrive. It must be stored. Refined products, petrol, diesel, jet fuel, LPG, and other products must leave the facility and reach consumer across several countries. Lamu has an important advantage. The port is being developed as part of the LAPSSET corridor, which is Lamu Port, South Sudan, Ethiopia transport corridor. Existing planning documents envisage pipelines, tank farms, export facilities, as well as land reserved for refinery-related development around the port. That infrastructure is potentially what makes the Dangote proposal different from simply building another refinery somewhere along the coast. The refinery could become the industrial anchor around which storage, pipelines, transport, and petrochemicals, as well as other businesses, develop. But there is a warning here. LAPSSET cannot remain a collection of partially connected projects. For a 17 billion US dollar refinery, the project schedule will depend on interfaces between multiple parties, that is, port authorities, pipeline operators, road and rail agencies, energy regulators, county authorities, as well as environmental agencies and neighboring countries at large. From a project management perspective, this is a classic dependency problem. The refinery can be ready while the infrastructure required to feed or distribute it is not. That could leave billions of dollars sitting idle. Second, Dangote needs a market, and East Africa must provide that. Kenya is already a major regional fuel importing and distribution center. Government data indicate that Kenya imports essentially all of its petroleum requirements, with roughly 90% consisting of the so-called white products such as petrol, diesel, and kerosene. The scale of regional demand is also increasing. EPRA data reported in June showed imports of petrol, diesel, dual-purpose kerosene for Kenya and transit market rising from 8.7 billion liters in 2022 to 10.41 billion liters in 2025. That provides the commercial logic for Lamu. Dangote is not building simply for Lamu County or even for Kenya. The intended market is regional. Uganda, Tanzania, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Rwanda, Eastern DRC, and other markets that could potentially become customers depending on infrastructure pricing, and also trade arrangements. Kenya's government is already seeking stronger regional backing for LAPSSET, with the stated objective of improving transport links, border operations, as well as regional value chains. That region dimension may ultimately determine whether the refinery succeeds. But here comes the difficult part, which is protection. The claim that Kenya should protect the refinery from cheap imported fuels needs to be treated carefully. There is a legitimate economic argument behind it. If Dangote spends billions of dollars building a refinery in Kenya, while foreign refineries can continuously land cheaper products, the Kenya plant could struggle to compete. Investors would then ask why they should commit capital to another large industrial project if the domestic policy framework leaves the project exposed to unpredictable competition. Dangote has seen this problem in Nigeria. The company has previously complained that logistics and port-related costs made it more expensive for marketers to lift products from its Lagos refinery than to source fuel from offshore storage hubs such as Lamu. But Kenya should be extremely cautious about what protection means. Protecting an investment is not the same as guaranteeing its profit. There's a major difference between enforcing fuel quality standards, preventing unfair trade practices, and creating predictable investment rules on one hand, as well as banning the cheaper competitors simply to guarantee market share on the other. Kenya consumers should not be forced to pay more for the fuel merely because a private investor has built a very expensive refinery. The government's obligation should therefore be to create fair, transparent, and predictable competition, not an artificial monopoly. Kenya's petroleum imports regulations already provide a competitive framework for products, including petrol, diesel, jet fuel, LPG, and fuel through the open tendering system. Any future arrangements involving the Lamu refinery would have to fit within that category, or that category of regulatory architecture or parliament, and the regulator will have to explain publicly why changes are necessary and how consumers will be protected. The Indian and Russia questions is more complicated than it sounds. It is tempting to describe foreign fuel from India and Russia as simply cheap imports that Kenya should block. The reality is more complicated. India is already a significant supplier of petroleum products to Kenya. The Indian High Commission in Nairobi lists petroleum products among India's leading exports to Kenya. Indian refineries also operate at enormous scale and can source crude from multiple markets. That gives them ability to compete aggressively in the international fuel market. Russia is another factor, and a major one, in global oil pricing. Although the situation is changing rapidly, In July 2026, Russia accounted for more than half of the India's crude oil imports, according to Reuters, demonstrating how deeply Russia crude has become embedded in the economics of some Asian refining operations. So the challenge for Lamu will not simply be stopping cheap Russian fuel, to be competing against large, efficient international refineries with access to global crude supplies, shipping networks, as well as established market. The answer cannot be permanent protection. The answer has to be competitiveness. Third, Dangote needs predictable policy. That's the third thing. The third thing that we think he's asking for. This may be the most important demand of all. A refinery that costs around 17 billion US dollars cannot be planned around policies that change every election cycle. The investor needs clarity on taxation, environmental rules, import arrangements, crude supply, port charges, land, pipeline access, product standards, foreign exchange arrangements, and regional trade. That does not mean the government should surrender its regulatory authority. It means the rules should be known before billions of dollars are committed. The experience of Kenya's petroleum sector shows why this matters. The country currently uses government-to-government arrangements for much of its fuel imports, with petroleum products supplied through the designated international companies and distributed through the country's downstream system. A future Lamu refinery would therefore enter the existing system rather than an empty market. The transition has to be carefully designed. If the refinery produces fuel but Kenya's procurement, storage, and distribution arrangements are not compatible with it, the project could find itself fighting the very system it was supposed to strengthen. And then there is a question of land. Land is not a technical footnote in a project of this magnitude. The refinery will require substantial industrial site, storage facilities, pipelines, roads, utilities, safety zones, and supporting infrastructure. Lamu already has a strategic advantage because government planning has reserved areas around the port for oil-related development, including a future refinery. But land acquisition and development must still meet Kenyan law, environmental requirements, and the rights of affected communities. That point cannot be treated as an administrative formality. Lamu is environmentally sensitive and socially complex. Recent reporting has already highlighted opposition from environmental groups to the proposed refinery. For a project of this size, an environmental dispute that reaches the court can become a major schedule risk. In project terms, social license is infrastructure. Without it, even the best engineering plan can be delayed. Kenya should also ask what it gets in return. This is where the conversation should be more demanding. The question should not simply be, what does Dangote want from Kenya? Kenya should also ask, what measurable value will Kenya receive for providing the platform on which this investment will operate? That should include local employment, skills development, Kenyan contractors, technology transfer, supplier development, tax revenues, infrastructure that remains useful to the country, and opportunities for Kenyan companies to participate in the refinery's supply chain. Dangote's Lagos refinery provides some evidence that large-scale industrial projects can generate extensive contractor and employment ecosystems. The company says its Nigerian refinery has supported local content development and trained workers in technical trades. But Kenya should not simply copy those claims into a memorandum. It should negotiate measurable targets in terms of how many Kenyans will be trained, how much procurement will be local, what percentage of skills positions will eventually be occupied by Kenyans professionals, what infrastructure will publicly be accessible. What happens if those targets are missed? Those are questions of serious investment engagement. The biggest risk may be overcapacity. There is one question that deserves to be asked without political excitement. Does East Africa actually need a 700,000 barrels per day refinery? Regional fuel demand is substantial and growing, but the proposed refinery is huge. The project commercial success therefore depends on becoming a regional exporter platform, not merely a Kenya's refinery. That requires reliable cross-border pipelines, roads, railways, storage, and customs systems. Without those connections, the refinery could be built in Lamu, but remain commercially dependent on a market much smaller than its theoretical capacity. The numbers must therefore be tested through a serious bankable feasibility study. Expected demand, product mix, look at crude sources, shipping cost, refinery utilization, competing refineries, regional tariffs, taxes, financing cost, as well as projected margins. That analysis should be made available to the public in appropriate form. The 17 billion US dollars project should not rest on political optimism. Lamu could become an energy hub, but only if the pieces move together. There is a larger opportunity here. Kenya has struggled for years with dependence on imported refined petroleum products. The government itself has identified the need for strategic stocks and reliable competitive supply. Its 2025 National Petroleum Policy calls for a strategic petroleum stocks, secure, reliable, and competitive supply arrangements. A successful Lamu refinery could therefore do more than produce fuel. It could stimulate a wider industrial cluster in terms of storage, logistics, petrochemicals, marine services, engineering, manufacturing, and energy-intensive industries. It could give LAPSSET a major anchor tenant. It could also strengthen Kenya's position as a gateway to the wider Horn of Africa. But the opposite is also possible. If Kenya grants excessive protection, the country could end up with an expensive refinery whose commercial interests become too closely tied to government policy. Consumers could carry the cost. If Kenya provides no certainty at all, the investor may decide that the risk is simply too high. The sensible middle ground is clear: stable rules, competitive markets, strong infrastructure, and enforceable public interest obligation. And now the bottom line. Dangote's Lamu refinery could become one of the most consequential private investment in East Africa modern economic history. The reported $17 billion price tag and 700,000 barrels per day capacity make it a project of continent significance, not merely a Kenyan construction project. But Kenya could resist or should resist the temptation to measure success by the size of investment announcement. The real test will be whether the government can build the ecosystem around that in terms of land, port infrastructure, pipelines, transport corridors, regional market access, predictable regulations, environmental safeguards, and competitive fuel market. Dangote needs Kenya to reduce the risks surrounding the investment. Kenya in turn needs Dangote to accept that those guarantees cannot come at the expense of consumers, competition, or national policy independence. That is the bargain that should be underpinning Lamu. If Kenya gets the balance right, Dangote's refinery could turn Lamu into a major East African energy and industrial hub. If it gets wrong, the country could spend years negotiating around a giant refinery while discovering that the building that plant was easier than making the economics work. The refinery may be Dangote's project, but whether it becomes a Kenyan success story will depend on the systems Kenya builds around that. So thank you for coming this far. If you are here for the first time, please consider subscribing to this channel. Watch other videos that you have done on this project. Watch others that you have made on East Africa content, and also Africa at large. So thank you, and let's meet in the next one.